Welcome to this installment of supplemental lectures provided by PNC's Concurrent Enrollment Program. My name is Alexandra Kindle, and I will share some information with you that comes out of my courses at Purdue University North Central. Today we are going to examine the First World War through the lens of race, specifically African Americans. In part 1 of this lecture, we examine the issues of the working classes during the Great War. The two groups had similar issues with President Wilson and his war. Now, this lecture is for students who have already learned a bit about the war generally, so if you have not started World War I, please come back to this lecture later. As a part of this lecture, we will also do a quick review of some pre-war topics, including the ideas of Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. After the Civil War, there was a brief moment when African Americans and their supporters saw change in the South. African American men voted and entered office for the first time, having the benefit of the protection of the Freedmen's Bureau and the federal troops. As a result of a contested election in 1876, Republicans agreed to remove the troops and give home rule to the white Southerners. By the 1890s, African Americans in the South had fallen prey to the discrimination and segregation that existed prior to the Civil Rights Movement. All gains had been lost, and Southern states enacted Jim Crow laws that legally allowed segregated facilities. These laws were upheld in 1896 with the Supreme Court decision Plessy v. Ferguson. Most African Americans lived in the South, where they were losing their rights, and whites were using the law, the economy, and vigilantism to make sure of it. Black folks had plenty to protest, but it had to be done with consideration of the violent backlash that could come. With all that said, one man emerged as the emissary of his people, bringing some hope without upsetting the status quo enough to endanger the people he tried to help. Historian John Hope Franklin called the period of black history after 1877 the age of Booker T. Washington, because he had become the dominant voice. He was schooled in producerism by a man named Samuel Chapman Armstrong at the Hampton Institute. Armstrong suggested that the products of labor were both about physical needs and more ephemeral ones. He said that labor was, quote, a spiritual force, that physical work not only increased wage-earning capacity, but promoted fidelity, accuracy, honesty, persistence, and intelligence, end quote. When Booker T. Washington was there in the early 1870s as a teen, he learned these ideas and became the most eloquent exponent of Armstrong's ideals and the best-known leader of his people during the Gilded Age. In 1881, when Booker T. Washington got to Tuskegee, it had just opened as the Negro Normal School in Tuskegee, Alabama. Normal schools generally taught young women to teach school, but the state of Alabama authorized its establishment and partially funded it to train former slaves in industrial pursuits. Booker T. Washington was the first teacher and its principal until his death. He was the perfect person for the job, well-trained, motivated, but not too radical. Washington's ideas about how to bring African Americans into a better social and economic position were made clear in his speech at the Cotton States and International Exposition in Atlanta in 1895. This speech is often referred to as the Atlanta Compromise speech because Washington exposed his hope for his people tampered by his understanding of white power in the Jim Crow South. He explained that the, quote, wisest among my race understand that the agitation of questions of social equality is the extremest folly, end quote. And the only way blacks would gain equality was to become important to society economically and accept segregation until then. He made this clear when he told the audience, quote, in all things that are purely social, we can be as separate as the fingers, yet one as the hand in all things essential to mutual progress, end quote. For Booker T. Washington, blacks would have to prove their worth over time. Whites, North and South, hailed his emphasis on vocational education without social demands. Southern whites appreciated his confidence in them, and he was treated with respect. According to historian John Hope Franklin, quote, the vast majority of blacks acclaimed him as their leader, and few whites ventured into the matter of race relations without his counsel, end quote, which is why the historian assigned the 1880s to 1915, which is Booker T. Washington's death, as the Age of Washington. He was the man who accepted reality and tried to make the greatest gains for his people within it. As the nation exited the Gilded Age and entered the Progressive Era, new voices within the African American community began to work for more than just compromise. W.E.B. Du Bois became the voice of this movement, bringing his particular experiences with him. Unlike Booker T. Washington, Du Bois was Northern raised, never knew slavery, and did not fear the kind of backlash that Southern blacks lived with. He had a Ph.D. from Harvard. He was the first African American to gain one, and in 1903 he published his essays, The Souls of Black Folks. As a historian, he understood the context of time, but as an African American, he also felt the frustration of slow social change. He wrote and edited works prolifically, and Souls of Black Folk was just one of many publications. One of the essays of Mr. Booker T. Washington and others, in that essay, he rejected Washington's acceptance of the status quo as set by whites in the South and argued for black civil rights by getting equal education, political access, and economic opportunities for them. Far more radical than Mr. Washington. As you can see, Dr. Du Bois had written many things beyond just this essay. He was a prolific writer and thought widely about race in the United States and the world, as well as the meaning of democracy. Starting in 1905, Du Bois and other like-minded African Americans began meeting at significant sites in African American history to start a movement to agitate for these ideals. Their first meeting was an important site for the Underground Railroad, Niagara Falls, and they then met annually next at Harper's Ferry, Boston, and Oberlin. The Springfield race riot of 1908 called attention to the need to do something about the poor conditions of African Americans in the North. At Springfield, Illinois, a county sheriff protected two black prisoners who white locals wanted to lynch. The two men were wanted for rape and murder, and the sheriff moved them to protect them from lynching. The men had been arrested but not tried. When the mob could not lynch these men, they turned their attention to those who helped to protect the prospective lynchees and destroyed the black business district and residential neighborhoods in the process. In the end, 7 were dead and $200,000 worth of property was destroyed. A conference of both black and white reformers was called, and the Niagara radicals received invitations as well. Jane Addams attended, as did the great anti-lynching crusader, Ida B. Wells, along with educators, social workers, and ministers. They pledged to work for equal rights of African Americans and demanded enforcement of the 14th and 15th Amendments. The biracial NAACP came out of this conference, and its board members started the magazine entitled The Crisis, which became Du Bois's baby. By 1918, The Crisis had a subscription base of 100,000 readers per month. The paper advocated more jobs for blacks and better safety, especially against lynching. But more important, the NAACP members formed a legal redress committee, and its lawyers won 3 major cases in front of SCOTUS within 15 years. By 1921, there were more than 400 branches throughout the nation. This was an organization that created action. By the time Woodrow Wilson ran for election in 1912, African Americans had learned to live in the segregated South, and African Americans also organized and voted, trying to use the system to their best advantage. During the Progressive Era, neither Teddy Roosevelt nor Mr. Taft had inspired much confidence in African Americans. Woodrow Wilson came along and wooed a good number of African Americans away from the Republican Party, and his election brought a Southerner into the White House for the first time since the Civil War. Wilson promised before the election that African Americans could count on him for absolute fair dealing, and that's a quote. Southerners, expecting the support of a Southern president, flooded the Congress with discriminatory legislation. At least 20 bills advocated the segregation of races on public carriers in D.C., and there were others. They wanted Jim Crow to come to Washington. Most of this legislation failed to pass, but Wilson segregated federal employees and restrooms and phased many African Americans out of civil service. Wilson clearly broke his promise, but my guess was that very few were truly surprised by any of this. In 1914, African Americans were little concerned with the war in Europe, as they had their own problems in the United States. Of course, in 1915, the movie Birth of a Nation was released. D.W. Griffith produced this film based on a book written by Thomas Dixon, who rewrote the history of the post-Civil War South, blaming blacks and Republicans for the region's troubles. The film also glorified the Klan that reigned in 1866 and 1867. Lynchings and other forms of violence increased. In 1916, Jesse Washington, you can see here, was publicly burned before a cheering crowd in Waco, Texas. Notice that there are kids in the audience. You can just see the tops of their heads. As white folks looked to war in Europe, Du Bois and other African Americans were more concerned about the effects of imperialist actions against people of color in the world. In 1915, President Wilson sent the U.S. Marines to invade Haiti, which upset African Americans as one more case of imperial nations determining the fate of smaller, weaker, browner nations. The United States had designs on the island since just after the Civil War. In the Gilded Age, those designs became more urgent as the U.S. built its empire. It would have made an excellent outpost, but the French had been the prime colonizers until Germans attempted to take over the territory. The situation in Haiti fell apart in the teens. Between 1911 and 1915, 7 presidents there were assassinated or overthrown. Wilson argued that the Marines could go and forestall anarchy, but even the historian of the U.S. Department of State admits that Wilson used this as an excuse to protect American assets and keep the Germans out. Nature abhors a vacuum, and Wilson made sure none existed. As one historian stated, the United States gained complete control over Haitian finances and the right to intervene in Haiti whenever the U.S. government deemed necessary. The U.S. government forced the election of a new American president, or pro-American president, by the Haitian legislature in August of 1915. The selection of a president that did not represent the choice of the Haitian populace increased unrest in Haiti. The invasion ended in 1915, but U.S. occupation continued until 1934. With these events in Europe and Haiti, Du Bois published his article, The African Roots of War, in the respected journal Atlantic Monthly. Africa was the continent of many exploited smaller nations that became a virtual symbol for the excesses of imperialism. There, great powers fought over the rights to gold, diamonds, cocoa, rubber, ivory, and the ever-sexy palm oil, while ignoring the rights of those who lived there. In the U.S., the entrepreneurs and politicians who benefited from this type of exploitation also exploited working men, but redirected the working class against others by asking them to share the spoil of exploiting chinks and niggers, and that's a quote, through imperialism. Basically, he was saying that the war could create a consensus uniting exploiter and exploited, redirecting class conflict to racial conflict. War with the draft, the propaganda campaign, and harsh punishment for those who stepped out of line benefited only the elite at the expense of everyone else. And to be honest, poop rolls downhill. People of color were at the bottom, getting the lion's share of it. At the beginning of the war, about 20,000 African Americans served in the regular Army and National Guard, mostly in segregated units. Once Congress passed the Selective Service Act in May, this provided for the enlistment of all able-bodied men. 2,290,525 black men registered, and 367,000 were called into service. While white and black men were being drafted into service, Congress only made provisions for training white officers. Students at black colleges such as Howard, Fisk, and Tuskegee began agitating for the training of African American officers. General Leonard Wood finally agreed to set up a separate camp if black leaders could come with 200 black men of college grade willing to participate. Howard University students sponsored the Central Committee of Negro College Men in May 1917 and collected 1,500 names in 10 days. The NAACP supported the camp even though it was segregated. African Americans involved in this wanted to get more African Americans into officer positions, and in October 1917, 639 African Americans were commissioned at Fort Des Moines in Iowa. Blacks were barred from service in the Marines, but served in almost every branch of the Army except the pilot section of the Aviation Corps. This seemed to be one way to break down barriers and end discrimination, using Wilson's war rhetoric for their good. Discrimination toward black men in the Army abounded, and the Federal Council of Churches created a committee on the welfare of Negro troops. The members of the committee investigated conditions at home and abroad. At Camp Green in North Carolina, they found there were 5 YMCA buildings providing services to white soldiers, but none for the 10,000 blacks there. Surprising, since the YMCA had been active in urban areas, helping blacks acclimate to city life along with the Urban League. Complaints flooded the War Department that blacks were insulted by white officers and forced them to work in labor details instead of posts for which the soldiers had been trained. African American troops went to France and found more than they expected. German troops learned that the 92nd Division was almost primarily made up of African Americans, and when they could not defeat the segregated unit through fighting, they produced propaganda to demoralize the troops. One circular asked, "What is democracy? Personal freedom, all citizens enjoying the same rights socially and before the law? Do you enjoy the same rights as the white people do in America, the land of freedom and democracy? Or are you rather not treated over there as second-class citizens? Is lynching and the most horrible crimes connected therewith a lawful proceeding in a democratic country?" That's a quote from one of these circulars. The Germans invited blacks to join the Germans and be treated fairly. There seems to be no account of any desertions, and the African American soldiers continued to fight for the democracy they could not have because of segregation and discrimination in the United States. This branch of the 92nd Division was rendered most valorous service. Here are a few images of African Americans going to war and arriving ready to fight. Moreover, in France, African American troops were treated well by the locals. African Americans moved freely among French people, and some white troops took it upon themselves to warn the French against the blacks. American whites told the French that African Americans could not be treated with common civility, that they were rapists, and that Americans were compelled to lynch and burn blacks in order to control them. In August 1918, a document was circulated among the French, secret information concerning black troops. It does not appear that any French people took this seriously. It does say a lot about the extent of American racism. Here's one more unit that proved to work hard for the war effort without the benefits gained by white troops. African Americans, like other Americans, supported the war through the Liberty Bond programs. There were 5 campaigns, and it has been estimated that black Americans purchased more than $250 million worth of bonds. Because many African Americans were involved in agriculture or worked as cooks, they were important to food production and conservation as well. More important, the wartime production in northern factories attracted large numbers of African Americans out of the South. Some came on their own, while others were enticed by labor agents who enticed workers with free transportation to the north. This was the beginning of the Great Migration that brought about 500,000 African Americans into northern cities. The South had little to keep them. What did they have? Economic troubles and Jim Crow. These 3 words don't mix, and it was a point that was not lost on African American leaders. In July 1917, the NAACP sponsored a silent parade to protest violence against African Americans. Banners read, "Mothers, do lynchers go to heaven?" and "Mr. President, why not make America safe for democracy?" Remember, there were others, especially the women's suffrage advocates and the socialists, who saw through Wilson's rhetoric about democracy. But here we can see African Americans pointing to Wilson's words. The black leadership of the nation also whipped up support for the war, hoping to gain recognition for African American loyalty during the war. This was a moment to get involved in any way possible. Woodrow Wilson's rhetoric about democracy gave African Americans hope for change. For both the working classes and African Americans, the war that promised good relations between labor and capital, and possibly some great recognition for African Americans, failed to achieve its aims. Really, America's participation did little other than end the war in Europe to the benefit of the Allies on the short term and to the detriment of the world on the long term. For a discussion of labor, please see Part 1 of this lecture. But as you can see from the list here, the end of the war brought the end of protections to labor and political radicals. Returning soldiers faced returning to the United States with little to show for their efforts overseas. There were lynchings after the war, even of veterans, but efforts of the NAACP and even some Southern whites helped to reduce that number in the 1920s. As one historian noted, beginning in 1921, the NAACP sponsored anti-lynching legislation such as the Dyer Anti-Lynching Bill and numerous other proposals to make lynching a federal crime. The sharp decline in lynching since 1922 undoubtedly had something to do with the fact that early in that year the Dyer Anti-Lynching Bill was passed in the House of Representatives. The Dyer Anti-Lynching Bill provided fines and imprisonment for persons convicted of lynching in federal courts, and fines and penalties against states, counties, and towns which failed to use reasonable efforts to protect citizens from mob violence. It was killed in the Senate by the filibuster of the Southern senators, who claimed that anti-lynching legislation would be unconstitutional and an infringement upon states' rights. However, the long discussion of the Dyer Anti-Lynching Bill was of great importance to the decline. Southern white organizations also began to condemn lynchings during the 2 decades before World War II. Among them were the Commission for Interracial Cooperation, which did research and issued publications providing additional facts on lynchings. And then there was the Association of Southern Women for the Prevention of Lynching, which was founded in Atlanta in 1930. Various other women's groups in the South were also active in the struggle against lynching. But of course, the Second Klan had been revived because of Birth of a Nation. But this was the new respectable Klan, and its members hated everybody. Thank you for joining me today. I hope that this information will help you in your studies. We all hope to see you at PNC when you're done with your high school degree.